Hey there! So we already know quite a lot about Azure Databricks. We know how we can use it to transform our data. But actually, I did it so far by manually executing cell by cell. And obviously that's not how it's gonna run on production environment. So actually, how are we going to orchestrate our Databricks notebooks? And that's the topic for today, so let's get started. Alright, so let's talk about plugging those Databricks notebooks into our BI flow. And as always, I will start with our diagram that shows our typical BI flow, because I want to make sure that you understand the thing that I want to show today. So just simplifying our diagram, because I've been doing it so many times already. We have various data sources, files, databases, APIs, and so on. And what we are doing with it is that we are ingesting this data into a data lake. So this is our ADLS Gen 2. It has multiple layers depending on our needs, how many we need. The first thing we do is to ingest the data to the raw layer using Azure Data Factory or other service that works in our case. Usually it is ADF because it's pretty good at data ingestion. So this is ADF, not a dragon, that's ADF icon. At least I hope so. Then what we are doing with our ingested data is that we might want to use Databricks to transform it. And we can use autoloader or just our manually crafted notebooks. Depends what we want to achieve. And we'll repeat this process multiple times depending on number of our zones in data lakes. And the thing is that, alright, but how are we going to plug those Databricks notebooks and their execution into our BI flow? And if you were paying attention, the answer should be pretty obvious. Because let's think how we orchestrated our processing so far in the ingest phase. Well, we simply created pipelines in Azure Data Factory. Because we know that ADF is pretty good at two things. So first of all, it can efficiently move data from one place to another, like when data ingestion process happens. But secondly, it is pretty good at orchestrating the data, which means that it can be used to orchestrate the whole process. And maybe already have some kind of a pipeline that you're using to ingest the data, and then we can expand it to do those data transformations. So the thing that we are looking here for is the orchestration capabilities. Orchestration. And orchestration simply means organizing our process into various steps that are executed in proper order, one by one. And ADF is pretty good at it. And today I will focus on plugging execution of Databricks notebooks into Data Factory. But please note that ADF is not the only option we could use. I will show you also some other option, but in many cases ADF is a way to go. Alright, now today I would like to focus just on this connectivity part, or collaboration between Data Factory and Databricks. And to make it simpler, I will use a very simple Databricks notebook that actually doesn't do anything special. It doesn't have any logic. It doesn't read the data from data lake. It doesn't write the data to it. I just want to show you the behavior. And then you should be able to extend this example and add your own logic. Alright, so let's jump into Azure Databricks and let me create a very simple new notebook that will be executed from Data Factory. So I have this dp203 directory inside which I will create a new notebook. And let me call it orchestration sample. And now I want it to be super simple, so I will just use a print command that, as you can guess, is used to print some text like hello world. And I'll use my demo cluster, the one that we've been using so far, as a compute layer. And let me just verify that it works. So let me run this cell manually still, but that's development time. And indeed it works. So you can see this hello world statement was printed by my notebook. And let's pretend that this notebook has some additional logic, that this is exactly what we want to execute from Data Factory. So let's switch to Data Factory and let's try to run our pipeline that would call our Databricks notebook. So I will create a brand new pipeline. Let me call it orchestration sample. And let's pretend that that's the pipeline that contains our logic. Maybe it has the ingest part that does something. So I will simulate it by using this wait activity. So let's assume that this part, it is used to ingest the data. And then what we would like to do is to call our Databricks notebook and obviously connect those two activities. So the data transformations happens after our data was ingested. So how to do this? Well, simple. Let's try to find something about Databricks activities. And we've got 3: notebook, jar, and Python. And we'll use the first one, namely this notebook activity. So let me drag it into the canvas. Let's give it a name like execute our sample notebook. Let me connect them using onSuccess connector. And what we have to do is, well, we've got to indicate, all right, but which Databricks workspace we want to connect to. And as always with Data Factory, when we are dealing with some external party, we've got to define a linked service, namely a connection string. But the thing is that we don't have any linked services for Databricks created yet. So let's create a new one. So I will go to Manage tab and I will simply create a new linked service. And now, if I just start typing Databricks here, nothing will be found except for this Azure Databricks Delta Lake. It's not what we want to have. And it's not the thing that we would like to use, because by default, the filter is set to data stores. And we've got to switch to compute services. And here, yes, we have Databricks. So don't panic if you don't see Databricks on the list of your linked services. Probably you have to switch the tab to the compute layer. So let's use Azure Databricks as a type of my linked service. Let's give it some dummy name like Azure Databricks linked service. Then I've got to indicate, all right, to which workspace I want to connect. And I will just use this drop-down experience to easily select my demo DB203 Databricks 1 workspace. And then we've got something strange, this select cluster options. And we've got 3 choices. Either we can use new job cluster, or we could use existing interactive cluster, or existing instance pool. But what is this? What cluster we've been using so far? And basically, let's think about the process of data engineering. So basically, when a developer starts to work on a notebook, he usually needs a lot of trials or attempts to make the notebook correct. So this person will connect to Databricks using, let's say, browser, write the code in the UI, execute cell by cell until everything works. Exactly the same stuff I've been doing so far. And this is called interactive authoring, that the developer is interactively working with the notebook. It's writing the code and it is executing it just to verify that it's working. And it's a pretty good approach. Now, the thing is that in the case of production execution, when the notebook is already tested and verified that it is a good stuff, we don't need this interactive experience because there will be no one connecting to Databricks and clicking a run button. No. On production environment, we want this process to be automated. So we don't need these interactive options. So if we don't need them, then maybe there is an option to choose a cluster type that doesn't have them and therefore is cheaper. And that's what this choice is all about. And if we go into Azure Databricks pricing page, and you will find the link in a video description, you can find a comparison of various features by those compute types. And it was called here interactive cluster, right? And interactive cluster is simply this all-purpose compute from documentation, while this new job cluster is this job compute one. And as you can see here in the description, those interactive clusters, well, they are used for interactive workloads when developer is working with it interactively, while jobs compute is used for automated workloads, like on production. And please note that one of the differences between these two is lack of those three features like interactive clusters, notebooks and collaboration, and ecosystem integration, whatever that is. Alright, but how does it impact the price of those two cluster types? So let me scroll down a bit up to some numbers. Alright, and let's analyze those two types of clusters, all-purpose compute and jobs compute. And because we are using premium tier, let's also focus on these values. And as you can see, those interactive clusters, when developer can connect and work with the notebook interactively, is almost twice expensive as the jobs compute one. Which should give you a hint that, well, if you don't need this interactive experience, and to be honest, on production you don't need this, then maybe you should use this jobs compute cluster just to make it cheaper. So that's the difference between these two. Now, I will start in a simple way by using this existing interactive cluster. And if you are wondering, my demo cluster that I've been using right now, it is an interactive cluster, this all-purpose cluster. And I will be using this demo cluster as a first test when connecting from Data Factory. So let's try to configure it. Alright, so we know that we want to use some existing interactive cluster. Great, but then we've got to somehow authenticate to our Databricks workspace. And here we've got three choices. Either we use something called access token or managed identities. Alright, so again, what's the difference? So let me talk about this. So managed identities, you already know what it is. It's just an identity of a data factory. We've been using it so far and it's a recommended way. Now, access token is a way when we can impersonate a user and connect to Databricks as a given user, as a given person. So for example, me, Piotr, I can generate this personal access token for me. It is just a string. And then I can use it, or someone can use it, to connect to Databricks. And from Databricks point of view, it will think that it is me connecting to it. So this process will have the same permissions as I have. So as you can guess, it's not the recommended way, because for automated processes, we don't want to run them in the context of a user. No, we want to have a dedicated account like this managed identity. But because those personal access tokens, they are used widely, I want to show you this behavior, and then we will switch to managed identity. So I will use this access token method first. Great. So how to get this access token? So let me jump back to Databricks, into settings, and then under, I believe, developer section, I will be able to generate access token for me, because I'm logged into Databricks as me, as Piotr. I will be able to generate this token for me. So let me create new token, like, let me give it a name like ADF demo. Let's give it a lifetime of 1 day. So tomorrow it will be no longer working. And let me just copy this stuff to a clipboard. All right, so we have this value. So this access token is a kind of a combination of login and a password that authenticates someone as me. All right, so let's go back to linked service. Now, I could hard code this access token here directly in a linked service definition, but you already know that I don't really like hard coding stuff in linked services, especially those secrets, and access token is a secret. Fortunately, we have Azure Key Vault that we know is a super choice for storing our secrets. So let's use it. And the best thing is that we already have Key Vault created that is configured together with this data factory. So data factory and its managed identity can grab secrets from the Key Vault, because we've done this before. So let me jump to this demo Key Vault table Key Vault, and let me add a new secret, because personal access token is a secret. So let me call it Databricks personal access token. And let me paste the value from the clipboard. All right, so we have new secret created, this Databricks personal access token. And then I will reference it from my linked service definition. All right, so let's choose a linked service to a Key Vault. So nothing new, we've already done this before. So that's the Key Vault linked service. Then managed identity of data factory will connect to a Key Vault and grab a list of all secrets that are available there. And we know that we want to use this newly created Databricks personal access token secret. All right, in its latest version. And then we've got to choose some cluster. And I will use my demo cluster, because that's the one that we want to use. And let me verify the connection. And it's working, great. So let me create the linked service. And let's go back to our pipeline. And let's try to use this linked service in my execute notebook activity. So let's indicate that, yes, I want to use this newly created Azure Databricks linked service. And then I've got to indicate, all right, but what notebook you would like to execute. And here I will just browse to my notebook. So super simple. And it was in, where it was? In shared? No, in DP203 directory. It was this orchestration sample notebook. So that's the one. Let me publish all of this stuff. And let me debug this pipeline. And hopefully everything will work just fine. So let me check this. So now pipeline starts with this wait activity that simulates the ingest process, and then my notebook from Databricks, this orchestration sample one, is being executed. At least I hope it is. We have our cluster up and running, so we shouldn't wait too long for the cluster just to start. And in a few seconds, we should see some output. And yes, we can see that the activity succeeded. So hopefully my notebook was executed. So if I hover the mouse over this activity, and then I click on the glasses icon, I will see this run page URL that will take me to Databricks page where I can see the execution logs that were generated once this notebook was executed. So let me open this and let's see how it looks like. And yes, so you can see that it really worked. This hello world output was generated. So that's great. And apart from that, we can see that the notebook was executed as Piotr, as me, because it used my personal access token. And secondly, we can see that it used my demo cluster as a compute infrastructure, this interactive cluster. All right, great, so that works. Now, obviously, this process is not perfect. It has at least two flaws. So first of all, it uses my identity because I configured the linked service to use personal access token, and that's not a recommended method. So let me switch it to use managed identity of Azure Data Factory. So let's jump back to Data Factory and let's create a new linked service. Again to Databricks service, but this time I will configure it in a different way. So let me give it some name like managed identity linked service. Again, I will choose Databricks workspace to which I want to connect. It's still my DymoDB 203 Databricks 1 workspace. I will be still connecting to this existing interactive cluster, to my demo cluster, but I will change the authentication type to managed identity. All right, and then I have to indicate which cluster I want to connect to. But the thing is that this list is empty, and I have to provide this cluster ID option. So what is this cluster ID? Later on, you will see that this list will be populated, but for now, let's focus on this cluster ID thing. So again, let's jump back to Databricks, to our compute tab. And here, if we go to the properties of a specific cluster, in my case, this demo cluster one, here you will be able to get this cluster ID thing. And it is actually available in multiple places. So first of all, if you take a look at the URL, here you will find this cluster ID. It is a part of the URL, this 0322 something. The same is available here, the same value. And also it is available here in this JDBC URL, and probably in some other places as well. So it's up to you to decide which one from where you want to copy. I will use this version, and simply I will paste it here as existing cluster ID, because that's identifier of the cluster to which I want to connect. And let me verify the connectivity. Let's see what happens. And it failed. It failed with 403 unauthorized error. And yeah, it makes sense, because this time I wasn't connecting as me, as Piotr, but I was connecting as managed identity of a data factory. But actually, this managed identity is not known yet to Databricks, is not granted any permissions. So we have to create the account for data factory inside Databricks just to make it work. Now, if you go into some of tutorials that are provided by Microsoft, let's say this one, that tells how to run a Databricks notebooks from ADF, you will see that they say if you use managed identity, and that's the stuff you want to do right now, then just grant a contributor role on Azure Databricks. It will work. Sufficient permissions will be granted. But the thing is that contributor role is super powerful, and effectively it will make this managed identity an administrator inside Databricks workspace, and that's not what you want to do. So don't grant contributor role. We'll do this in a better way, in a more secure one. But if you want to just play with this stuff, go with contributor role. But be aware what it means. So what we'll do instead is that we'll create this principal for ADF inside the Databricks. So let me grab a name of my managed identity. Let me go to Microsoft Entra to find this identity, because I will need one value to create this identity inside Databricks. So that's my enterprise application. Simply put, that's my identity that I want to use inside Databricks. All right, and then in Databricks, let me go to Settings, then to Identity and Access, and then Service Principals. I will create a new service principal for managed identity of Data Factory. So here I will create a new service principal that is managed by Microsoft Entra, because it exists in Entra. And here I need to provide this Microsoft Entra application ID. And this value is simply here. So that's why I wanted to find this identity in Entra, just to be able to grab this identifier. And let's go back to Databricks and let me paste it here. And let's give it a name like ADF Managed Identity Demo. And let me add it. And let me remove this allow cluster creation entitlement. Later on I will see what it changes. All right, so right now what we did was to, let's say we created a user for ADF inside Databricks. Great, but at this moment it is not granted any permissions yet. It just exists inside Databricks. So what we'll have to do is to grant it two types of permissions. So first of all, it has to be granted permissions to connect to my demo cluster and run some notebooks there. And if you go into documentation about compute permissions inside Databricks, you'll find those 4 types of permissions that can be granted. And the permission I want to use for Data Factory is this can restart. Why can restart and not can attach to? Well, simply because I expect my cluster to be stopped in many cases, and I want ADF to be able just to start it when it is necessary. And the permissions that grant this capability is this can restart one. So that's why I will grant this can restart access to my managed identity inside Databricks. I know it might sound complicated, but it's not really. All right, so let me go back to Databricks, to my demo cluster, and let's edit its permissions. And I will simply add this ADF managed identity demo principal that we've just created, and I will assign it can restart permissions. All right, let me save it. So right now ADF will be able to connect to this cluster, but apart from that, we've got to grant it permissions to run this particular notebook that we've just created. So let me go into this DP203. No, that's not this, it's not this folder. So it was here, I believe. Yeah. And let me grant again some permissions to ADF managed identity. And this time I'll grant can run permissions because I just want this ADF to be able to run this notebook. No edit, because it's not necessary, just run it on this particular demo cluster. All right, so hopefully from security point of view, everything is ready. So let's go back to ADF. Let's retry the connectivity part. And it succeeded. So connection is fine. So let me create the linked service. Let me publish it. And one more thing, we'll obviously have to modify the pipeline to make use of this newly created linked service instead of the previous one. So let me update this linked service to managed identity version, like so. And let's run it. And let's see what happens. Hopefully it will work as managed identity. So it will connect this time as data factory, not as me. And secondly, it is done in a more secure way than Microsoft has described in its documentation, because we are not granting this contributor powerful role that effectively makes someone an administrator inside Databricks. But it failed. So something is still wrong. So let's check the error message. And what they say is that, well, single user check failed. And they say that only Piotr can use this cluster because it was set with single user mode. And yes, I think that's the way we configured it. So let's go back to this compute settings of my demo cluster to double check this. And yes, it was set in the single user mode, and only me, only Piotr, was able to use this cluster. But please note that it worked previously when I used my personal access token, because even though the connection was made from Data Factory, Databricks thought that it is me connecting because we configured the linked service to use personal access token. So to make it right this time, we'll have to either change the access mode or just create a new cluster. And I will create a new cluster because I like this demo cluster, the existing one, and I would like to keep it. So let's create a new compute. And this time, again, let's try to keep it small, single node cluster, so it wouldn't cost too much. And this time, instead of a single user mode, let's say it shared mode. But the thing is that sometimes various properties, they cannot coexist. And that's the case. In case of a single node, in case of shared clusters, they cannot work unless we either enable credentials pass-through or table access control. We know what credential pass-through is, so let's focus on this table access control thing. And now, I won't dive too deep into this. Let me just show you where it can be set and what it is, more or less. So let's jump into settings. And it would be under security. Yeah, under security. We've got this table access control. So basically, this switch allows us to turn on more granular control and permission settings inside my Databricks. And you saw that if you would like to use this shared cluster, then this has to be enabled. So let me enable this. I've got to refresh the page, and that's it. I'm not going to discuss what exactly this access control means because it's out of the scope of this episode. So let's just try to create our shared cluster. Maybe this time it will work. So again, single node, shared, our command, and again something is not right. But this time it says that shared mode and single node, well, they cannot work together. So it means that either we switch to a multi-node cluster or we change to a no isolation shared access mode. So it's up to you to decide which one you prefer. But let's get crazy today. Let's create this multi-node cluster. So no longer a single VM will be used. This time we'll have more. So let's change it to shared access mode. That's fine. This time no issues so far. Then let me change the number of max workers to 2 because I don't want it to be too expensive. Let me choose, alright, this one is fine. I want to terminate my cluster after 15 minutes of no activity, and I think that's it. So let me create the cluster, and it will take a few minutes to provision, so I will be back once it is ready. Alright, so the cluster has been created, so let's verify that it is really working. So let me go into our sample notebook. Let me change the cluster that will be used, at least here, in this interactive experience, to this newly created one, and let me run it just to verify that everything is working just fine. Hopefully it is. And yep, it worked, right? So the cluster is fine. The one thing that I forgot to do was to grant permissions to this newly created cluster to manage the identity of my data factory. So let's fix this issue. So let me grant this. Can restart permissions. Alright. And let's go back to data factory. Let's modify our managed identity linked service, and let's change the cluster that should be used. And please note that this time in UI I can see names of those clusters. Why? Because we created the identity of ADF inside Databricks, and it is granted permissions. So no longer I have to type those IDs manually. Alright, so let me choose this Piotr's cluster, the new one. Let's verify connectivity. It works. So let me save it, publish. And in a second we'll see if it is working. So let's go back to our pipeline. Let's wait for the publishing to be finished because I don't want to debug it once it is being published. So it's done, and let's run it. And fingers crossed, it will be fine this time. It should. Alright, so this notebook is being executed. No error so far, so it should work. Let's just wait a bit. And by the way, you can see now that those options that we chose when we were creating the cluster, they really matter, like this access mode. Single user is good for learning purposes when it is only you who is going to connect to the cluster, but once there are more identities, more principals that would like to make use of this cluster, it stops working. And in the meantime, it worked. So our cluster could be used this time. So let's take a look at the logs and let's compare it with the previous execution. If I have it open somewhere, but I think I've closed it. Alright, anyway, we can see that indeed the notebook worked. This hello world was printed, but what changed is that this time this notebook was no longer executed as me, as Piotr, but as this ADF Managed Identity demo. And you can even see a different icon, this robot. It means that it was a service principal, not a person. And below, you can see that this time we use this Piotr's cluster. So that's how you can configure Data Factory with Databricks using Managed Identity and without granting this excessive contributor role. Alright, great. So we were able to handle the first issue, this authentication type thing. The second thing I would like to cover is the cluster type, because so far we've been using this interactive cluster, this all-purpose cluster, which is more expensive. And I told you that on production environments, we don't want to use interactive ones. So let's again create yet another linked service, but this time we'll use a job cluster, and you'll see how it differs. Alright, so let's go back again to a linked service creation, and let's create a third linked service. So this time let's call it Databricks Managed Identity, because we'll keep using Managed Identity, then job cluster linked service. Let me again choose Databricks workspace to which we want to connect. And the thing is that this time we'll use this option, new job cluster, not an existing cluster. And take a look at this phrase here. It is new job cluster. And that's the thing with job clusters. They are not created before like interactive clusters. No, they are created on demand when they are needed. Which means that here in this linked service definition, I will specify how I want this cluster to look like. And then when this pipeline will be executed, this cluster will be created, it will be used to execute the notebook on it, and then it will be deprovisioned. So it will just disappear. It will be available only for the duration of this pipeline. Alright, so again, let's change the authentication type to Managed Identity, because we know that it works. Then we've got to define our cluster, how we want it to look like. Similar stuff we did when we were creating this interactive cluster in Databricks. Here it is done in the linked service. So let me choose the latest Databricks runtime, 10.4, which has this long-term support. Then node type, well, let's go with the first value. Python version 2, that's fine, one worker, and that's it. So let's verify if it works. It is fine. So let me create this linked service definition. Let me publish it. Oh, come on. And then let's change our pipeline to use this newly created linked service. And we'll see how it looks like, if it will work. Probably not, because usually it doesn't work during the first attempt. So in Databricks settings, let's change the linked service to this Azure Databricks Managed Identity Job Cluster Linked Service, because that's the one we want to use. Let me publish it. And let's run our pipeline. Actually, let's debug it. So let's see what will happen. And now you will see in action that actually running your notebooks on job clusters might take longer than running them on interactive ones. It is because those clusters, job clusters, they don't exist at this moment. They have to be created first. In case of interactive clusters, they are already there, and maybe they are even up and running, so there is basically no delay. But here, as predicted, it failed. So let's see what's happening. And the thing is that our managed identity that we are using to connect to Databricks is not authorized to create clusters, because I explicitly unclicked this option because I wanted this error to happen. just to show you this behavior. So let's fix this. Let's go to Databricks, to this identity and access section, to our service principals, and let's modify properties of this ADF managed identity demo service principal. And here you can see those three entitlements. And the one that is missing is this allow cluster creation. So our managed identity is not able to create new clusters. And in case of job clusters, this is needed. So let me check it. Let's update this one. And let's rerun our pipeline. And this time it should work because everything is fine, I hope. And this time it will take a few minutes for the cluster just to be created and started. Now, the thing about this option, this allow cluster creation that is required here, it might be a dangerous option. It might be expensive option because take a look. Here inside Databricks linked service, we specified our cluster, including number of nodes, basically how big we want the cluster to be, which directly translates to how expensive it will be. And you can imagine already that there might be some developer who will define a very powerful, expensive cluster. And this managed identity, it will be allowed to create this cluster. So it might turn out that running your pipeline will cost you. It might be too expensive. Fortunately, there is a way to restrict or to limit the size or properties of the cluster. There is a feature inside Databricks that we can use to make it happen. Namely, it is called Databricks policies. I will not cover this today because it's out of the scope, but please be aware of those two things. That allow cluster creation entitlement might be expensive and dangerous. And if for some reason you need it, then think about using policies just to restrict the size and the cost of your cluster, of your virtual machines. And once we are waiting, it will take a minute or two more. Let me go into my resource group that was created for Databricks, because this time we should see more virtual machines than previously. Why? Because this time we have this Piotr's cluster that is bigger. It is a multi-node cluster, not a single node one. So hopefully, yep, indeed we can see even more virtual machines. Maybe some other cluster is up and running. So you can see directly here that the choices you make inside Databricks, they have impact on the number of Azure resources that are created under the hood. And all of those virtual machines, they are not for free. They will cost you money. So pay attention to the size of your clusters. All right, this pipeline is still being executed, so let me pause and we'll get back in a second once it is ready. All right, and the pipeline has finished execution, and you can see that indeed it succeeded. So this time everything was fine, and let's just take a look at the logs. And let's verify that the hello world was printed. It was run as our ADF managed identity, and this time it used this cluster with this strange auto-generated name. And let's compare it with the previous execution. Previously, we used this Piotr's cluster. This was the interactive cluster, and this one was the job cluster that was created on demand. So that's how you can make it happen. All right, so let's pause here for a second and let me summarize this, because I know it was a lot of stuff. So when we are orchestrating Databricks execution from ADF, which is usually a pretty good option, you have to think about few things. So let's start with the authentication types. You can use managed identity. And you already know that this is my preferred way of authentication. Identity. So let me use this green circle. Or you can use this personal access token that authenticates the process as someone. That's not recommended. Personal access token. Then let's assume that we chose the managed identity. And again, you have to choose a cluster type. And you had a choice of interactive cluster or job cluster. And interactive cluster, well, it is useful for development purposes. When a developer wants to write the code and then execute it just to verify if it works. So it is used for development. While job clusters, they are used for actual execution. Automated execution. Automated. And those job clusters are simply cheaper. So basically, for development time, use interactive clusters. Later on, switch to job ones if you want to pay less. All right, great. But let's take a look at our notebook, because it's pretty simple, right? It's just printing this hello world statement, hard-coded one. And usually in our notebooks, it wouldn't be so simple. Usually, we would like to parameterize them. We would like to make them dynamic. And you would like to be able to pass some value from ADF to them. For example, maybe you would like to pass a file name that is to be processed. Or maybe you would like to pass time range for which data is to be processed. Or maybe you would like to pass some flag that will have an impact on the processing, or some other thing that makes sense in the context of your logic. So how to do this? And simply, in Databricks, they call those parameters as widgets. And I will just use a UI to create a new widget, a single one. We can have multiple, but here I will just use a simple one. Let's keep it simple. So in the edit menu, you can find this add widget option. So let's call my parameter my text. It will be of text type, and the default value, let it be hello world. So if someone doesn't provide a value, I want this hello world value to be used. All right. And here you can see this widget, this parameter was added. Great, but then how to use it here? Because what I would like to do is to grab this value and print this stuff that was provided instead of this hard-coded value. So if I move my mouse over this widget, you will see a tooltip that tells you how to use it in SQL or any other languages. And because my cell, this print one, uses Python, so I will use this syntax and simply replace this hard-coded value with this dynamic one. So let's change the value of my parameter and let's run it. And in the meantime, oh come on, my cluster just stopped. So yes, I want to start it. And again, it will take a few minutes, so I'll be back in a second. All right, so the cluster is up again. My cell was executed. And you can see that this time it printed the value that I provided as a value of my parameter. So that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. All right, so let's use this widget, this parameter, from our data factory pipeline. So let's go back to the pipeline. And in this notebook activity under settings, here with base parameters, we can add those parameters, those widgets that we would like to set when calling this particular notebook. So let me add a new parameter. It was called in Databricks myText, and let's give it a value like hello world from ADF. And let's run it. And let's see if this value from ADF will be passed as a parameter to Databricks and then used inside the notebook. It should. If I didn't make any mistake, then you will see how easy it is to pass values from ADF to Databricks. And usually that's something that you would like to do, because hard coding stuff is usually not a best option. So let's just wait a second for this notebook to be executed. All right, and the pipeline has been executed. It took over 4 minutes because I was still using this job cluster that had to be created on every run, but it succeeded. And let's verify what was outputted by our print command. And yes, we can see that it was hello world from ADF, this dynamic value that we passed from ADF. And you can also see it here under parameters that indeed, as myText, I passed this hello world from ADF stuff. So that's how you can make your pipelines and your notebooks dynamic. And obviously here inside Data Factory, you don't have to hard code your parameter value. You can make it dynamic as well using this expression builder, the stuff that we covered previously. All right, great. But is there another option we could use to orchestrate those notebooks? Yeah, sure. So for example, Databricks on its own has its native way of running notebooks. So let's go to Databricks. And here you can see this workflows section. So that's the place where you can schedule your job to be created. And by job, I mean just a set of tasks to be executed. And one of the task types that we can use is just to run a notebook. So it simply means that Databricks has its own orchestration engine, let's call it this way. So if for some reason you don't want to use ADF, you can use Databricks jobs. So let me create a new job. Let's give it a name. Demo job orchestration. And let's configure its tasks, namely what you want it to do. So task name, run a notebook. Then I've got to indicate, all right, what task type I want it to be. And we've got some choices here. Obviously, we are limited to the stuff that Databricks can do. But in this case, it's fine. I will use this notebook type because I want to execute my notebook. Then I've got to indicate, all right, where is this notebook that you want to execute? It's in my workspace. Great, where in the workspace? So it was in DP203, this orchestration sample notebook. Then, all right, on what cluster? Oh, come on. On what cluster you would like to run this notebook? And here I could choose one of those existing all-purpose clusters, those interactive ones, or use a job cluster that will be created on demand. So it's up to you to decide which one you want to use. For simplicity, I will use this one because it's already up and running, so it will be faster to execute this. So let me use this cluster. And finally, what I would like to do is to add a parameter, because again, I want to pass some value to this notebook. So let's add a new parameter, this myText, and this time I will use hello world from Databricks job. And that's it. Let me create a task. Obviously, I could create a schedule for it, so it would be executed automatically. Let's say every every day at midnight. Something similar to what we have in Data Factory. But in my opinion, Data Factory is just better at orchestrating stuff. But if you would like to do everything inside Databricks, you have such capability. And if you would like to make your process, your job more complex inside Databricks, you could add more tasks that would be connected somehow. But for now, let's remove this. And let me just run this job manually by using this Run Now option. And in a second, it should be executed. Hopefully my cluster is still up and running. And in a second, you will see the output that was generated from this notebook when it was executed as a Databricks job. And as a parameter, you can see that indeed we passed this hello world from Databricks job value. And the output, well, it used this parameter. So again, we made a notebook dynamic, but this time it was orchestrated from inside of Databricks. All right, so to summarize, when you create your notebooks, well, you are executing them manually, cell by cell, until you are satisfied with the way they work. But then, most likely you would like to plug them into your process, into your pipeline. If you're using Data Factory as your orchestrator, that's pretty easy. You just have to drag this Databricks notebook activity, connect it with some other activities, and then configure it. Namely, indicate which notebook has to be executed, what parameters, if any, have to be passed, then decide about authentication type, and the managed identity is, in my opinion, the best way. And finally, you've got to decide, all right, about what cluster type and what cluster should be used. And here, you should pretty much always go for a job cluster, unless you've got some good reason to use interactive ones. But usually, you want it to be cheap or cheaper. So job cluster is a way to go. And that's it. It's super simple. The same with running notebooks from Databricks. It is possible. You could use those Databricks jobs to do the trick. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.